So in Cuba, you guys might have seen the news that, protests have erupted all over Cuba. So not just in the capital, but all over, right? And they've been saying this on all of the mainstream media, MSNBC, CNN, you name it. And I'm going to show you a small clip here. Yes, you'll have to suffer with me. I'm going to show you a small clip here. This is from CBS. And it's just a few minutes of their coverage. Just look at what they say about these protests. Look what they say. Anti-government protests that have erupted. And we're going to go through it point by point, and then I have a lot to say about this. A lot to say about this. Okay? So let's take a look here. Ready?
Thousands marched across several cities yesterday in some of the biggest anti-government demonstrations on the island nation in decades. People took to the streets protesting food shortages and high prices as the country suffers through a crippling economic crisis, exacerbated by the pandemic. So Manuel Bojorquez is in Miami, where demonstrators also came out this weekend.
Okay, I'm going to stop her right there. Now, she's going to correct herself a little bit after, but what did she say? She said that people are going through an economic crisis. You care to explain why? Why is there an economic crisis? Oh, there just is one. And she says exacerbated by the pandemic, which is true to some extent. But why is there an economic crisis? You don't think it maybe has something to do with those pesky sanctions, those embargoes that you've been putting on Cuba? Every single president has been putting on Cuba. You don't think that does something to countries? You don't think that's something like siege warfare where you cause starvation, lack of medicines? No? You don't think that has nothing to do with it? Really? Okay, let's continue.
In a show of solidarity with Cuban protesters. Manny, good morning. What's going on?
Yeah, good morning to you. We're standing outside of Versailles restaurant. This is typically the epicenter of demonstrations and rallies here in Miami's Little Havana neighborhood, and last night was no different. Thousands came out here to support those protesters in Cuba, and while the demonstrations...
Okay, again, something that they don't explain to you. Of course you have thousands of people coming out to support protests in Cuba. You know why? Because Miami is where all the Cuban exiles are, right? So, this is like asking people in Virginia if they like the CIA. Wait, yeah, okay, no, great. What does that mean? Anyway, let's continue.
Here may be commonplace. What's happening in Cuba is not only rare, but historic. Thousands of protesters gathered in communities around Havana and across the island nation, shouting freedom and we are not afraid. Although protests began peacefully, they soon took a more violent turn as police and special forces moved in later on to break up the demonstrations.
Here we go. Here we go. Regime forces are cracking down. It's just copy paste, right? Let's do this for Iran. Oh yeah, let's do this for Syria. Oh yeah, Cuba, Venezuela. Regime forces are cracking down. They moved in, right? These brutal goddamn Stasi types. Look what they're doing to the peaceful protesters. Copy paste, right? I feel bad for the people at the State Department have to copy paste all this stuff all the time.
President Miguel Diaz-Canel himself made an appearance at one protest and spoke with some of the citizens who confronted him. Demonstrators here say they are fed up by food shortages, rising prices, collapsing infrastructure, and the government's response to a rising number of COVID-19 infections. On Saturday, Cuba recorded nearly 7,000 new cases.
Again, rising food prices, right? Food shortages, lack of medicine. This is all a product of sanctions. I literally spoke to my cousin in Syria a few days ago. They got to wait in line for bread, right? You got enormous queues for fuel. There's no medicine. This is all because of sanctions, right? And that's in Syria, a country that was wheat self-sufficient, that was a net exporter of wheat. So it's not a country like Syria is not just bringing in wheat. Syria is exporting wheat. That's how much wheat it has. Do you understand? That's how much crops it's growing. Syria has oil fields. It don't need oil and fuel. It can do it. No. Do you see what they do with sanctions? They cripple you. Same thing with Iran. Same thing with Venezuela. right? I spoke to the UN Special Rapporteur on Sanctions. Dude, when I put up the full thing, you will listen to what she says about what children in Venezuela, what happened to their school supplies, never mind their food. Man, look at how dishonest they are. They frame it in a way that makes it sound like it's the government's fault, right? And they make no mention. It's not like, oh yeah, well, some of this is because of incompetence or corruption in the government, and some of this is because of sanctions and, the embargo, which is really hurting people. No, it's just, oh, look, it's just these magical food prices that just keep rising by themselves. And they do this with every single report. Go watch a report on the elections in Syria. The elections, they're not even talking about anything else. Just they mention, there's an economic crisis, but they don't actually tell you why. There's no mention of why there's an economic crisis. Same thing with Venezuela. Same thing with Iran. The people are so dishonest. This is not reporting. This is propaganda. When you report, you give facts. You say the truth. This is not the truth. They're obfuscating. They're lying. They're hiding what their government is doing, what the Americans and the European Union are doing to Cuba, are doing to Yemen, are doing to Venezuela, Syria, Iran. They're not telling you the truth.
On Cuban television, Díaz-Canel blamed the protest on the U.S. and its trade embargo for a severe impact on Cuba's recent economic downturn.
Right? So here we have the passage where they say sanctions, but they say, oh, look, it's the regime that's saying it's sanctions. No. The sanctions are real. Sanctions are siege warfare. This is a fact. This is quantifiable. You can literally plot this on a graph, how it destroys economies. It's not the Cuban president who's saying that. This is a fact. Sanctions hurt, right? It's a fact. It's scientific. You can quantify this. And every time they say, look, it's like this is just it's a counter argument that the regime is saying, like it's propaganda. It's not real. No, it's just the president who's saying that. Oh no, it's not, honey. Oh no, it's not. And look, they do the same goddamn thing here, right? Look at this headline over here. This is from The Guardian, okay? Look what The Guardian says. Cuban president claims protests part of U.S. plot to fracture Communist Party. Like as if there is no history of the U.S. trying to fracture the Communist Party in Cuba, right? The Bay of Pigs, that's just imagine. The Cuban president just made all that up, right? Operation Mongoose, he just made all that up. All these times they tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, it is just made up. Right? This is just something the Cuban president is saying because, he's a liar or something. Dude, you can literally go on the CIA's website and find the documents of how they tried to screw with Cuba and Iran and various, and various other countries. They don't even hide it anymore. It's just right out there in the open. They admit to it. It's incredible. It's really incredible, man.
Passed many more regulations, many more sanctions against it, which basically has cut off all income coming into Cuba.
Portia Siegelbaum is a CBS News producer based in Cuba.
I think the Biden administration, he at least said at the beginning he was going to review this policy and make changes, but nothing has happened.
Right, so that's the only honest bit of reporting in the entire segment, right? They just mention it for 10 seconds that, like Biden, he said he's going to remove sanctions, but there's nothing to it. But they don't actually go into detail. They don't tell you that what it causes, right? And if you go and you watch the reports from CNN and Deutsche Welle, there's no mention of the word sanctions. It's not there. It's not there. The word sanctions or embargo is not there. And they did the same thing with the Syrian elections, as I just told you, because these were a few weeks ago, right? Iran's elections as well. They always talk about an economic crisis, and they just never tell you why it's there, right? It's just magical. It fell out of the sky. So this is how they brainwash people. They brainwash you into thinking that, this is entirely 100% the fault of this government. So they're trying to manufacture consent for, further regime change, foreign intervention, bullying at the UN Security Council, these kinds of things. So that when you see Uncle Sam sending troops, you don't give a shit because you're like, oh yeah, I remember this government is evil. They're starving their people. Who told you that? CNN? This is unbelievable, man. Look at this. I just want to show you the rest of the report and then continue, right?
Several politicians have expressed their support for the people of Cuba and those protesters, including Cuban-American Senator Marco Rubio. As one defector told our CBS Miami affiliate, seeing those protests was, quote, magical. Anne-Marie?
Well, speaking of that, do we know what the latest is on the ground in Cuba now?
That's something we will have to monitor. We don't know at this point whether those protests will be allowed to continue, as you saw that there are already government pushback against those demonstrations. So today will be a day to see maybe who has been arrested, how those people are being treated, whether the internet is being restored on the island because it was knocked out in several parts as those demonstrations were happening. So there are a lot of questions, of course, about what's happening there. But you can imagine that here in Miami, these people who have come out here to support those protesters may be out here again expressing their support.
Yeah, let me ask you about that. You know, you point out that the restaurant where you're at is sort of the epicenter, sort of the heartbeat of the Cuban.
So did you hear what he said about the internet? He said that, oh yeah, the internet is being cut, right? Let's take a look over here. So if you just do a quick look at this. This is from CBS. Sorry, this is from ABC, not CBS. This is from ABC, but you can find this from various other outlets. What did it say? Cuba's internet cut off, a go-to tactic to suppress dissent. So we've seen this before, right? In other countries. For example, during the Arab Spring, you had, I think, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was both Tunisia and Egypt who shut down the internet. Why? Because people were using Twitter, they were using Facebook, they were using social media to organize protests, right? Incidentally, when they were doing this in Iran in 2009, the State Department in the US went and specifically requested from Twitter not to do maintenance on the website, to keep it online, basically, just to make sure that people can continue organizing protests and you know, sowing dissent on Twitter. So they know very well that it can be a vehicle for, you know, insurrections, right? This is a word that they love. And anyway, I just want to point one thing out. So here they're saying, oh, look, this is a go-to tactic for dissent, right? Oh, look at these dictators. They just go and shut off the internet. They do a complete blackout when it suits them. Okay, here's a counterpoint. I remember in Syria, during the Arab Spring, right? The government unblocked Facebook, YouTube, all of these social media sites in the middle of the Arab Spring, right? Meanwhile, in Egypt, Tunisia, they were blocking social media. They were blacking out the internet. Do you think that they reported about that? Have you ever heard about that? I'm telling you because I saw that with my own eyes. I was there. Have you ever heard about that from the media? Of course not, right? Here, they tell you that the internet is cut off. Have you ever heard about the blackout in Syria? This is after the war's already started, right? So when they unblocked the internet, they unblocked Facebook and YouTube in Syria. This is beginning 2010, 2011, right? And then a few years later, the Americans completely they crashed the entire internet in Syria for a day. They tell you about that? Of course not, right? So this is just a small point I wanted to make. They'll point this out when a country does it, but they won't point out the reverse, right? So they only report negative things. They never report anything else. It's just worth noting. Now, do you remember this article over here from what is this? I mean, Biden was saying this during his campaign, his presidential campaign, but this article over here is from March, right? So, excuse me, April from last year, right? So what are they saying here? During the presidential campaign, they're saying Biden says he would return to Obama-era relations with Cuba. What does that mean? That means that, you know, Barack Obama, he opened up a new chapter of relations with Cuba, right? So you have to understand, for 50, 60 years, right, since the Cold War, the Americans don't have relations with Cuba, right? for a wide variety of reasons. They refused to recognize the communist government. They refused to recognize the revolution. Then you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, which they I'm sure they teach you about, but they don't teach you about the Bay of Pigs, do they? Right? So this is when the Americans, the CIA particularly, tried to organize a coup. Well, they didn't try to organize a coup. They organized the coup. It just failed. And they sent a bunch of exiles and etc. They basically tried to get these people to overthrow to invade Cuba and overthrow the government, right? So multiple times they tried to assassinate Castro. I lost count how many times. There's multiple books about this. You know, they've been bullying Cuba for a long time, and of course it's been under embargo, right? Maybe you've seen in movies sometimes. Is that a Cuban cigar? Because they're not allowed, right? But it's much worse than that. It's not about cigars. They don't tell you what the embargo does to a country, what sanctions do. That they don't tell you. But now Donald Trump, he gets into office, and he reverses what Obama did, right? So Obama had reestablished ties with Cuba. There's no more embargo. Trump comes in. He's like, no, this is all out the window. I'm going to start the maximum pressure campaign. He does this with every country, right? So the maximum pressure campaign is a sick, sadistic way of starving people to death, of depriving them of medicine, right? Depriving them of money, of foreign currency, depriving them of being able to interact with other countries and engage in commerce and trade and finance. And what does that mean? That means that they, in the case of Yemen, for example, most of the food there is imported. And it's not done through NGOs. It's done through companies, right? So you put sanctions on Yemen, on Ansar Allah, which is what Trump and Pompeo did in the last days of the administration. You're basically starving the entire nation after they've already starved Yemen to death. And Trump targets Iran's oil sector, banking sector. He targets Syria with the Caesar Act sanctions in June of last year. And he targets Venezuela with more sanctions. And he targets, of course, Cuba with more sanctions, right? And Biden says, oh, no, I'm going to return to Obama era. I'm going to do what Obama did, right? I'm not like Trump. I'm going to reestablish ties with Cuba. I'm going to lift the embargo. Where is it? This guy's been in office for 6 months now. 6 months, okay? With Yemen, he acted pretty quickly, although the U.S. is still supporting Saudi Arabia in various other capacities. They already have enough blood on their hands. It's too late. It's too little, too late. Here, they've done absolutely nothing, right? Biden says he would return to Obama-era relations with Cuba. And then what does the White House say? What does the White House say over here? Look at this. This is from April. This is from April this year. The White House says a shift in policy on Cuba, not one of Biden's top priorities. So that was Jen Psaki, the White House spokesperson, right? Do you see how many times they've lied? Do you see how much they lie, these bastards? Look how much they lie. I want to say Donald Biden, because that's literally my point. There's no difference between them. Joe Biden is no different from Trump. And I told you about this. I told you, I said it a million goddamn times. There's no difference between these two nor their predecessors, right? The main foreign policy of the United States is treating other countries who don't do as they say with animosity, right? Bullying them. Look at the Abraham Accords that Trump signed, right? Normalizing ties between Israel and Bahrain and the UAE. He moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and recognized Jerusalem as the Israeli capital in violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. This is illegal international law. Do you think Biden reversed that? No. Has Biden reversed the sanctions against Syria? No. Has Biden stopped supporting Saudi Arabia entirely? No. Has Biden lifted sanctions on Iran? No. Has he re-entered the nuclear deal? No. Has Biden lifted sanctions on Cuba? No. How is he different from Trump? Dude, for someone who's living in Cuba, who's living in Syria, they wouldn't know if the president changed or not. And this is what's so messed up. American presidents, American governments affect non-Americans more than Americans. People around the world are more affected by what the United States does than its own citizens. This is a fact. This is a truth. And now what's happening with Cuba, what you have to understand is that, Cuba, they're the first country in Central Latin America to have developed the first COVID-19 vaccine, the first, right? And they do this under embargoes. So they've developed a vaccine and they don't have enough syringes. And because of this embargo, they cannot import syringes. Again, you have to understand something, man. This is not an exaggeration. Perhaps to some people listening, this sounds so outlandish. Like, what? What do you mean they can't get syringes? Yes, they cannot get syringes. It's much worse than that. The U.S. is blocking them from getting ventilators as well. Because the way it works is that if Cuba, the Cuban government wants to buy syringes from a company, right? The U.S. says, hey, if you sell syringes to Cuba, we're going to fine you. If you have assets, if you have accounts, if you have anything in the United States, we're going to take it from you. We'll confiscate it. We'll fine you. We'll even put you in jail. You can go to jail, right? So this is how sanctions work. It's basically pressuring companies, entities, other countries not to trade, not to engage with the governments you're targeting, right? And who suffers? It's the people who suffer. So, meanwhile, America is doing this crap. Look at what Cuba is doing. Cuba is sending doctors around the world to help fight the pandemic. The United States sends Marines basically they send their armed forces and contractors and mercenaries around the world. They put around military bases around the world. They make war, and Cuba sends doctors. That's the difference. That's the difference. And what's astonishing is that you have you had the United States angry at countries who accepted doctors from Cuba. See this? This is from africanews.com. All right, so here, the U.S. criticizes South Africa for accepting Cuban doctors. Can you imagine that? This is when? This is from last year in April. So Cuba sends doctors everywhere, and the U.S. was going around and pressuring them not to take in those doctors. Like as if, I mean, this is so twisted and evil. Like what? They're literally doctors. And of course, Trump, he comes out and calls them slaves. Yeah, other countries do nice things, and the U.S. just comes and tries to denigrate that, to destroy it, discredit it. I don't know what to say, man. It's awful. Here's some more stuff, right? So Cuba sent 2,000 doctors and nurses overseas to fight COVID-19. Cuba beat the pandemic from developing new vaccines to sending doctors overseas. These are various headlines I'm reading to you, right? And there's the difference. That's what the U.S. has done underneath. So it's really interesting when in these reports, they come and say like, oh, you see, Cuba, they've failed to contain the pandemic, and the entire economic situation is because of the pandemic. No. It's not just from the pandemic. The sanctions are doing a hell of a lot worse to the country than the pandemic. And again, as a matter of fact, they've handled it quite well, especially compared to you and many other countries, right? So I mean, this is really incredible, right? So just as I was telling you here, they've deprived Cuba of syringes, right? This is from MR Online. This is Cuba. So the U.S. blocks coronavirus aid shipment from Asia to Cuba. Again, this is from last year in April, right? So this is ongoing. This is not just now. And Biden has lifted none of this. Absolutely none of this. And again, it's astonishing to me how these Americans, and not just Americans, they're European allies, they'll come and say, we stand with the people of Cuba. We stand with the people of Syria. We stand with the people of Yemen. We stand with the people of Iran. Oh, and by the way, here's some sanctions. Go starve to death. Here's some bombs. Why don't you go and die under the rubble of our Hellfire missiles? Really? That's what standing with the people of Cuba means? Depriving them of syringes? How sick and twisted is that? That's what standing with the people of Syria means? You send them Al-Qaeda to kill them? No thanks. Go stand alone. No one wants you to stand with them. So you have this little rat over here, Marco Rubio, right? Who, of course, is promoting these protests in Cuba. And, of course, you have Blinken. Antoine Blinken, mon ami, vas-y, on va t'écouter un peu là. Let's listen to what he has to say.
They criticized Cuba's authority. Over the weekend, tens of thousands of Cubans took to the streets on the island to exercise their rights to assemble peacefully and express their views. The protesters called for freedom and human rights. They criticized Cuba's authoritarian regime for failing to meet people's most basic needs, including food and medicine. In many instances, peaceful protesters were met with repression and violence. The Biden-Harris administration stands by the Cuban people and people around the world who demand their human rights and who expect governments to listen to and serve them rather than try to silence them. Peaceful protesters are not criminals, and we join partners across the hemisphere and around the world in urging the Cuban regime to respect the rights of the Cuban people to determine their own future, something they have been denied for far too long. Over the weekend,
I mean, this is incredible how many lies he can fit into 1 minute, right? As part of the job application, it's not how many words can you type per minute, it's how many lies can you fit into a minute, right? So, I mean, several things here, man. The Cuban people have already, they've exercised their right to self-determination. You're the one who's trying to stop them, right? They've had a revolution for over 60 years. They're quite happy with it. And he's a goddamn liar, because this is what the United States does. They try to, okay, first of all, about the violence. I just want to say one thing. You cannot show me one clip, right? One clip from Cuba right now of anything that comes close to what happened during the George Floyd protests. Dude, the George Floyd protests, they were spraying people with some kind of weird pesticide shit. I don't even know what that was. The NYPD was literally running over people with their cars. You remember that, right? They were plowing through crowds, through crowds of people in broad daylight. You saw this. It was filmed on the ground from atop, right? You saw how people literally just kneeling, are suddenly just, they're pulled up by 3 officers. They're just dragged away. Have you seen anything like that in Syria or in Cuba, as they're saying right now? Not even close. Do you remember that old guy, the 70-year-old who the Buffalo Springs police just pushed for no reason? Literally no reason. They cracked his skull. Have you ever seen anything like that? You dare to talk about government crackdowns and regime violence? Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ. I mean, this hypocrisy is unreal. It is unreal. They dare to talk about human rights. My goodness. My goodness. And then, of course, what happens, man? He says here that, tens of thousands of people have come out to protest against the Cuban regime, right? They can't say Cuban government. No, they have to say regime, right? To delegitimize it, to portray it as authoritarian, et cetera, et cetera. Listen, man, I want to make something clear. You can go to any country in the world that the United States claims is in an uprising. You can go to Syria. You can go to Iran. You can go to Venezuela. You can go to Cuba. And of course, you will find people who don't like the government. This is normal. This is normal. But just because you have some people there, that doesn't mean it's the majority. And this is where the U.S. media, the corporate media steps in. What do they do, man? Number one, they lie. They lie about the effect of sanctions. They don't tell you that there are sanctions. People who watch this, they have no clue what sanctions are if they watch the mainstream media. They have no clue the devastation that it inflicts on these countries, right? They lie about the sanctions. They don't tell you that this is the U.S. fault, the EU's fault. And then what do? They take the discontent of a minority in the country and they amplify it so big to make you think, to make you believe that everyone in Cuba hates the government now, all of them, right? And then they don't show you the people who actually support the government. Look, man, again, I don't care about your opinion. It's not about my opinion, anyone's opinion. This is about reporting. You can't come here and claim to cover Iran or cover Syria or cover Cuba or Venezuela and hide that the majority of the population likes the government. Dude, that's not reporting anymore. Look at this. You remember with Syria? Look what they did with Syria. Did you see any of this on mainstream media? Did you see any of this after the elections? Right? You remember how many people were celebrating Bashar al-Assad's victory? Enormous crowds. I mean, I cannot even keep up. They were in Damascus, in Umayyad Square, Saht al-Amawin, in the port city of Tartus, all over the country. Did you see any of that on mainstream media? No, because this is not accurate reporting. They're liars. It's propaganda, right? And here they're doing the same thing with Cuba. They're doing the same thing with Cuba. They're trying to take a few thousand people, whatever the number is, and make you think that it's the whole country. It's not the whole country. This is ridiculous. Look at this. Look how they're lying. This is from Asa Winstanley. So he's a great friend. He's been on the show before, Electronic Intifada. Look what he said here. He quoted something from The Guardian, okay? He says, sure, Guardian, makes total sense that, quote, anti-government, unquote, protesters would fly the flag of Fidel Castro's 26 July movement. You see here? They're literally running out of material to make up these lies about, oh, look, it's a revolution all of a sudden. Oh, my God, there are so many people. They have so little proof. They're literally using photos of people who support the government, who are flying the flag of the revolution. Look, here's more. This is from Rose on Twitter. Quote, what the U.S. media tries to spin as mass uprisings against socialism in Cuba versus the actual real-life mass socialist movement in Cuba that the U.S. media will tell any lie to stop you from finding out about. Right? So they'll show you what's on the left, but they won't show you what's on the right. Ever. And this is the exact same playbook with Syria, with Iran, with Venezuela, the same goddamn playbook. Every single time. Underneath, Rosa continues, there are about 11 million people in Cuba, and over 1 million of them are literally in the march, depicted in the photo on the right, up here. The people of Cuba overwhelmingly support the socialist revolution and will fight to defend it. So down here, this from Telesur. Once Cuban president Diaz-Canel called the revolutionaries to seize the streets, to take to the streets. Hundreds filled downtown Havana to chase away groups that have gathered to stage protests against the revolution. I mean, you won't see any of this. Why don't they show you this on TV or in print? Why are they so afraid of showing you the truth? Right? Why are they so afraid? So again, this is the job of the mainstream media. They never ever show you the popular support, and they take a small fraction of a fringe of the society and make it out to be something enormous. Right? So that way, when they start a war, you're like, yeah, well, this is good. Look, they're going to help the majority of Cubans who want a revolution. A revolution against the current government. Right? Oh, look, I'm so happy that we're bombing Syria. That's what people in Syria want. This is brainwashing. This is brainwashing. This is how they make you acquiesce. They make you fall asleep. They turn your brain to mush. Right? This is how they lobby for intervention. Right? This is how they'll go to the UN. They'll try every means possible. Right? They'll try anything in the book to get foreign troops there. Right? On top of sanctions. And sanctions is part of that too, right? If they can't get troops there, they'll starve you to death. And what will they use? They use this crap as a justification. Right? And they use it also as an excuse to boost opposition groups. I mean, like, you should see the money that the U.S. has pumped into opposition groups. Not just in Cuba, all over the world. Extraordinary, astronomical amounts. Idem for the British government, right? So we know these tactics. It's very important to pay attention to this because, and I feel like this is, at the same time, right? I feel like this is kind of it's a weird disclaimer that we have to say this, right? Like if I come here and I show you, look, the United States has a history of trying to overthrow the Cuban government. The United States has a history of trying to plot assassinations and trying to invade and trying to topple the Cuban nation. I don't need to put a disclaimer and say, but hey, man, at the same time, the government has done such and such. These people try to be like, they pretend to be objective or something or neutral. Like, yeah, I disagree with U.S. interventionism, but you know what Assad has done? Oh my God, do you know what Maduro has done? Look, I don't, that's not the point here, okay? That's not the point here. If you dislike someone, that doesn't mean and they're a bad person, they happen to be a bad person, or whatever you've accused them of, that doesn't mean you can go and murder them because you say that they are such and such. You can't do that. The same here with the U.S. The U.S. cannot go violating other countries' sovereignty because they say that the leader of this country did such and such. I don't give a shit. You have to respect the sovereignty of these countries. We're not fucking discussing this or debating this. It's not a fucking discussion. If you have a problem with that, if you think this is debatable, you are a fucking colonizer. You're imperialist scum. So let's be very clear here, right? What the U.S. is doing in all these countries, what it's doing to the axis of resistance, to Yemen, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, this is evil. This is imperialism. They're trying to meddle in these countries, and they're manufacturing consent. They're absolutely lying. The entire government, bipartisanship, every single channel you turn on, they are lying to you about what is happening there. Right? They have a long history of trying to screw with Cuba. Long history. Goes without saying. Right? Everyone should know this. This is Cold War History 101. And now it doesn't change, right? They never stop. So I think this is disgusting. You must always exercise caution and nuance when you hear anything about Syria or Iran or Venezuela or Cuba or Yemen in the mainstream media, especially in the Anglosphere, because 99% of the time, it is fucking horseshit and it's lies. Again, this is not me saying that. If I didn't exist, it would still be lies. They have a history of lying. They have a history of making up the most ridiculous claims. They lied about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. If they lied about that, they'll lie about anything. And they do. They lie about literally everything. So just always remember, when you say, oh, look, these government protests, oh my God, the people are, they're rising up against it. Dude, look at the documents from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the UK, the FCO, how they set up all these groups, Zinc, the Integrity Initiative, Zinc, Incostrat, ARC, and then they created the White Helmets. They literally did this to wage a propaganda war, to make it look like there's more support for this so-called revolution, that, oh, look at these crimes, even the made-up chemical attacks that the government has done. They do this all the time. They've done this with Russia as well. I covered that with Max Blumenthal, with Chris Williamson, how they're doing an entire campaign of disinformation against Russia, right? They always talk about, oh, Russian disinformation. No, it's them actually who are doing it. Everything they accuse other countries of, they are doing. Britain is doing it. The U.S. is doing that, and to a degree that is astronomical. Astronomical. So we really have to be careful here. This is a long-ass segment, but it requires a long-ass segment because, these people, they have no shame. And I just want to finish with one thing over here. Oh, God. I mean, look at this. Look what Len Khodorkovsky says on Twitter. Quote, when oppressed people around the world express their desire for a better life, note the symbol they pick. Right? What do we have over here? We have people in Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, and Hong Kong marching with American flags. Right? So you won't be surprised to learn that this person over here, Len, he used to work for the State Department, right? So I find this honestly hilarious. If he wasn't a propagandist, he was just an average person, I would think, man, you're so close. You're so close. You're right over you're just about to get over the finish line, but you just don't quite finish. This is some people in the comments basically said, this is how CIA employees identify each other. Yeah. Yeah. And then you had some nut job over here, some guy I think who's running for Congress, right? So is he running? No, it says representative. Yeah, so he's already elected. Look what he says. He's in Florida. Never heard of this guy. He says, this is Anthony Sabatini. He says, high-ranking communist officials in Cuba should be given an ultimatum now. Either immediately assist in the transition of government away from communism or be prosecuted and executed thereafter. Holy shit. Holy shit. And you dare to talk about authoritarianism in other countries? What the fuck is that? I love how you as a U.S. official or a European official, you could just go on Twitter and fucking threaten to bomb and execute the ministers, the dignitaries of other countries Remember Trump, he said, I'm going to bomb Iran's cultural sites, which is not just an attack on Iran, it's literally an attack on numerous UNESCO World Heritage sites. Yeah, nothing. Yeah, sure, you can leave that up, right? That's totally not an incitement to violence, right? Dude, he's literally threatening executions. What the fuck? This is some ISIS shit. And you want us to believe that these people are interested in democracy? Oh, man. I can't deal with people who drink the Kool-Aid, really. I really try my best to, but, you know. Anyway,